Thanks everyone for being here this afternoon for our program, How to Be Your Own Best Friend. And this is co-sponsored by the Children's Grove. And for those of you who aren't familiar, the Children's Grove is a local nonprofit organization with the mission to inspire a culture of kindness and to support the mental and emotional well-being of our youth. My name is Lauren Williams. I'm the Adult Services Manager for the Columbia Public Library. And before we get started, just a little Zoom housekeeping. If you have questions during the presentation, you can type those into the chat as you have them. There may also be some interaction in the presentation, and you can put your responses and thoughts in that chat. And then I'll be helping our presenter keep an eye on those. Today's program is all about self-compassion. At the library, we are about literacy, and that not only means information literacy and reading, but also health literacy. So we are so glad to be providing a learning opportunity about the basic principles and practices of self-compassion at this program that's fueled by the work of Dr. Brene Brown, the great Brene Brown, as well as world-class compassionate leaders, Dr. Chris Germer and Dr. Kristen Neff. And with us today is Emily Arth. Emily is a licensed clinical social worker, an educator, a clinical counseling hypnotherapist and psychotherapist, and she is an expert provider of shame resiliency interventions and the only practitioner in mid-Missouri certified in the work of Dr. Brene Brown. So we are so glad to have Emily sharing with us her expertise today. Thank you, Emily.
Sorry, I think I was muted. Hi. So thank you for having me. I just want to remind the audience before we begin that I cannot see the audience. You can only see me. So if you are here today, if you would say hello to us in the comments section, that would be wonderful so that I can get a sense of who is in the room with us. So yeah, we're going to talk today about how to be your own best friend, how you can learn some everyday skills for applying self-compassion to your life. So she already introduced me. A little more about me. I live locally in Columbia, Missouri. I am a practice owner. I own Empowered Life, but I do work with clients across the state of Missouri, and I do education across the United States. And so I am a psychotherapist, a hypnotherapist, and an expert in treating complex trauma. That's really my area of specialty. And as she already mentioned, I do facilitate the work of Dr. Brown. I am part of her international community, her cohort that follows her research and takes that deeper and deeper as the research develops. And I am most passionate about helping people tap into their infinite potential by teaching them skills of resiliency and skills for aligning with their authenticity. So if those things interest you, you're in the right place. And our agenda today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what self-compassion is, if you're not familiar, why it's important to us, why we care about it. And then I'm going to take you through an experiential exercise around self-compassion so that you can learn how to cultivate kindness in your everyday life. Because I'm very interested in creating practical tools that people can use to integrate knowledge into their everyday life. Sometimes we spend a lot of time learning about concepts, understanding the definition of self-compassion, but I'm most interested in creating a practice of self-compassion. And so I'll just let you know ahead of time that we will be taking some time to do this exercise together. So if you can be in a place where you can focus and have some quiet time to reflect, that would be ideal. So what is self-compassion? Basically, right, I've left the definition right here. It's extending compassion to yourself in instances where you are feeling inadequate, feeling like a failure, or just generally suffering. And sometimes when we use these words like failure and suffering, they can feel really scary, and our brain can tend to go like, "Oh, I don't really think I deal with that. I don't really think I encounter that. Like I feel pretty adequate." And that's a normal first reaction to have because it is vulnerable to admit that we feel these things. However, these are things that show up in our everyday life in little ways. For example, just now when I came into the room, I tried to pull up my presentation and it wasn't working appropriately. And I had to use some compassion and recognize that everything was going to be okay. Worst case scenario, if we didn't get it up and running, we would still have a presentation and it would still be meaningful. So I want you to think about this in terms of everyday moments in your life that come up over and over again where some level of suffering or anxiety is present. That applies to all of us. So, Dr. Kristin Neff, if you are not familiar with her work, she is considered one of the world leading researchers in the area of self compassion. And she works very closely with Dr. Chris Germer, who is a practitioner who is applying her knowledge and coming up with practices to practically apply her knowledge to the larger population. And so I've had the joy of training with both of them. And Dr. Kristin Neff says that there are three elements of self compassion. The first being self kindness, second, common humanity, and the third is mindfulness. So, self kindness is really alluding to how I talk to myself in my own mind. Do I speak to myself with kindness or am I harsh? Do I rush myself? Do I pressure myself? And a mantra that you can kind of store away in the back of your mind that's very helpful to align with self kindness is asking yourself, am I speaking to myself the way I would speak to someone that I deeply love and respect? And overwhelmingly, the people that I work with say, no, I do not speak to myself the way I speak to people that I love and respect. So if you fall into this category of feeling like, wow, I can be really nice to other people, but when I really reflect on myself, I'm not necessarily extending that same kindness to me. And our inner voice, our inner dialogue, a lot of that is adopted by our caregivers, whether that's our parents, it could also be teachers or mentors or grandparents. But we have people that are close to us in our life when we're developing that model for us how to parent ourselves. And when we become an adult, a lot of those voices become internalized, and that is how we continue to parent our own inner child. And so, if you grew up or were around people that used any level of harshness or criticism, then you're probably going to be prone to use that with yourself, at least at times. So, the second element, which is common humanity, this alludes to the fact that we are all part of a larger collective that makes up one human experience. And though we are all individual and we have our own individual experiences, we can connect universally in our emotional experience. So, most of us know what it feels like to be sad, to be grieving, to be anxious, whatever it might be. And so, an element of practicing self compassion is actively reminding ourselves I'm not alone in whatever suffering it is that I'm going through right now. So, say I have depression, I may be alone in a room with depression, and that may make me feel alone. And for sure, the voice of shame is going to tell me that I am alone and that people can't relate to me. But the voice of self compassion says, even though you're alone in this room, you're connected to millions of people around the globe who are suffering from depression right now. And so we know when we apply this gentle and nurturing, I'm not alone, that just by reminding ourselves of that common humanity, it serves to alleviate some of the suffering. So if you can remember that the next time you're feeling any negative feeling, to just tell yourself, I'm not alone. I'm connected to a lot of people right now. And then finally, the third element, which is mindfulness, is just noticing, how do I talk to myself and how do I treat myself? And is that treatment upholding my well-being or taking away from it? And many people are not in the practice of observing their own thoughts or their emotions. In fact, the majority of Americans, when asked to identify what emotions they felt in the last week, the vast majority of Americans can only identify 3 feelings that they felt in the last week, which is extremely disconnected from their emotional experience because most of us are feeling 3 or more feelings in any given moment. So, building this mindful awareness, being able to observe your thoughts, your inner dialogue, as well as your feelings, is an important part of being able to extend kindness and care to yourself when you're suffering. Because if you don't even notice that you're suffering, it's going to be very difficult to extend that kindness and care and well being. So, we want to know if I'm going to change my habits around the way I talk to myself, what difference does this make? Because it's going to take some effort to figure out how I can shift my inner dialogue from being more critical or harsh to being kind, nurturing, and supportive. And so much research has backed that people who have higher levels of self criticism are overall less healthy people, they're less productive people, they're less satisfied with their life. And they just generally are not producing or creating as much as they could be creating. So many of us are under the illusion that if we're harder on ourselves, we're going to be more productive or we're going to be more creative. And that's wrong because people that have higher levels of self-compassion, they have stronger immunity, they have less sick days taken from work, they have more mental and emotional resilience. That means when they go through difficulties in life, they're able to bounce back more readily because they notice when they're getting out of balance sooner, and they also know what to do to bring themselves back into balance. They also have improved creativity. They're more innovative people and they're more willing to take risks, obviously more calculated risk, right? Not just impulsive risks, but they will step out, right? They'll put themselves out on a limb to try something new or to entertain an idea they have that maybe nobody else has entertained before. And they're more willing to think outside the box. At work, they're also more productive people. They have less overall stress. They are increasingly satisfied with their jobs, and they have higher stamina and higher output. And the reason for all of these things is because someone who has a high level of self compassion knows, no matter what I go through, I'm going to have my own back. So I don't have to be afraid to be flexible and try something new. Because if I do fail or if I do end up experiencing disappointment, I can handle that because I nurture myself through that and I care for myself and I support the fact that I tried something new instead of tearing myself down for going out on a limb and then being disappointed or encountering failure. So we're going to now move into this exercise that I've prepared for you, where we're going to learn how to cultivate kindness for the inner critic. And I chose this exercise for you because in everyday real life scenarios, what typically happens is we become aware of our inner critic, and so the inner critic is already gearing up, saying things to us that are making us feel not so great. And we notice that, and then we have to shift into something else. And if you are in the habit of being more critical or harsh to motivate yourself, on a brain, a physiological level with your brain, what has happened is you have created a very strong neural network that is creating this inner criticism. And so now, when you encounter suffering, your brain is sort of defaulting to the inner criticism pathway, right? Because that's like a highway in your brain. The wonderful thing about your brain is that you can change its physical structure depending on the way you use it. even past the period during which your brain is initially developing. So this is called neuroplasticity, your brain's ability to adapt and change and grow throughout your lifetime. So when you're practicing self-compassion, such as in this exercise I'm going to share with you, it is challenging because you are actually creating a brand new physical structure in your brain. You're making a brand new neural network. And you only have to do something new one time to form a brand new neural network in your brain. But that network is very thin and weak. It's like a hair compared to a rope. And so every time you practice that, it's like you're going over that hair and you're making it thicker and thicker and thicker. And so if you find that it's challenging to come up with more compassionate self-talk in this exercise, that's why, because you're actually making a brand new physical structure in your brain. So what you're going to need for this activity, you can either have a pen and paper, or you can, of course, use a device. Anything you can type on would be fine. So your phone, your tablet, your computer all work well. Okay, so to begin, step one, I would like you to identify something that you have tried but struggled to change. So I don't want you to choose something very difficult, like the hardest thing you've ever tried to change, but something moderately difficult, like a 4, 5, 6 on a scale of 10 in terms of difficulty. And I've given you some examples here, like procrastination, overspending, being overproductive, raising your voice. And so when you think of that thing, I just want you to write it down, whatever it is. Okay. Now, once you have that thing, I want you to take a moment to reflect on, what does your inner critic say when you try to change that thing and it doesn't work out the way you want it to, when you're struggling? And I've given you some examples of what inner criticism can look like. You know, what's wrong with you? Why can't you just do this? You're not doing enough. You know, you could be doing this or that. Why are you not doing that? And I'm going to put a timer on for us just to give you a little boundary. And I want you to try to think of, you know, more than one example. There are probably numerous things if you really sit with that. And if you're having trouble coming up with things, I encourage you to exercise a little patience and reflection. Maybe put yourself in your mind in an example from real life where you encountered this. Okay. And then I want you to reflect now on the tone of the inner critic. So if I was in your head and I was hearing that voice of the inner critic, what does the tone sound like? You know, is it hateful? Is it nervous? Is it condescending, harsh? Something that I haven't listed here, reflecting on that. And as you reflect on the tone, I also want you to see if you connect that tone to anyone that you know. Does it sound familiar? You know, and it doesn't have to be a caretaker. It doesn't have to be a parent. I just had someone a few days ago tell me it was a coworker who often talks out loud to himself, and she was noticing that she was starting to adopt that in her own inner dialogue. Okay, so I want you to reflect that part of you is the inner critic, the voice of the inner critic, but there's a bigger part of you that is not the voice of the inner critic. And so the bigger part of you is actually receiving the words of the critic. So I want you to reflect on that part of you, the part that's receiving the criticism, and to write down, how does it affect you to hear those words and to be treated that way? You know, in my example, I said it makes me feel defeated and not want to try at all, could give me like the urge to smoke, eat, or sleep to escape my feelings. If you're having trouble coming up with it, sometimes it's helpful to ask yourself, what do I have the urge to do when I hear that? And again, you know, if you're not used to reflecting in this way, it may not be very easy to identify this. So being gentle with yourself if you're having trouble identifying it. Now I want you to think to yourself, if you had a best friend or a family member that was going through the same situation and they were saying all of the same critical things about themselves, what would you say to them? if they were saying this to you about themselves. So in my example, I said I may say to them, it's not true that you're lazy. I think you do a lot of meaningful work. I know it can feel like you aren't doing enough when you have a long to-do list, but maybe you're just taking on too much at one time. So what would you say to a friend who is in the same situation? And notice too, when you're looking at what you would say to a friend, are you validating their feelings or do you tend to go into like a fix it mode? Because validating feelings is an important part of self-compassion. I tell a story that when a little kid, is running toward you on a playground and they fall down because their shoes are untied and they get that shocked look on their face and they start crying, they don't want you to look at them and say, "No, you're fine. You're not bleeding. Come over here. Let's tie your shoes." That's very emotionally invalidating. And that would be an example of going right into the fix it mode, as opposed to saying, "Oh my goodness, that hurt, didn't it? I saw that. Come here." And then giving them a hug and validating the feelings before we go into the fix it mode. But empathy, which is connecting with our emotional feelings as well as the emotions of other people, not everybody practices empathy that much or feels comfortable practicing empathy. So empathy and compassion can work hand in hand with each other. But we want to do our best to lean into the feelings and validate the feelings first when possible. So now, switching perspectives again, this inner critic is not being particularly nice. But it is trying to sort of save you or spare you from something. So reflect on, in your example, what might the inner critic be trying to save you or spare you from by trying to criticize you into making that change? Think of the critic like it's a fearful voice that actually has good intentions for you, but it's fearful and that fear's coming across. So what might it be trying to save you from? I gave some examples that could be like, feeling like a failure or looking incompetent, being unreliable, doing too many things, but not doing any of them well. And I would say that of the questions in this exercise, this question is typically the most challenging for people to connect to on their own. So if it takes a minute to think of what the critic may be trying to save you or spare you from, that's completely normal. And if you can't identify what the critic is trying to save you from, just extend some kindness and compassion to yourself, knowing that that's okay, that that's a place for growth. Okay. So now if you were able to connect with the thing that the inner critic is trying to save you from, take a moment to thank the inner critic for trying to help you, right? See if you can extend genuine thanks to the inner critic. This is sometimes called an exercise in loving kindness. Loving kindness is another element or skill that we use under the umbrella of self-compassion. And when we are practicing loving kindness, we typically start by extending love and kindness to ourselves, then extending love and kindness in our mind to someone that we know and we love very much. Then we try extending love and kindness to someone that, we're kind of neutral about. We're not really excited or, repelling them. We're just kind of neutral. And then the most difficult is when we try to extend genuine love and kindness to someone that we would consider to be at odds with, or even to be an enemy to us. And so I think that this is extremely applicable in this time that we're living in, where we have so much divisiveness. We can start practicing this loving kindness with our own inner critic, which in a way is like an internalized force of resistance or even sometimes an enemy to us. And by doing that, we will definitely become better at extending genuine loving kindness to people outside of ourselves like that as well. So finally, and I know that I'm cutting some of these words off, I'm trying to fix it, but it's not really being fixed. Let's see. Let's do that. So what would your compassionate self, this is the part of you that is the wisest part of you. It's the part of you that says, I see how this inner criticism is causing you to suffer, and I don't want you to keep suffering. So try to make a change in this regard to the best of your ability. So your compassionate self is like the consummate inner mother. And I say, don't even think of your own mother, because all of us also have some type of upsetting or painful experience with our own mother. Think of it like the most ideal mother, saintly, angelic, whatever resonates with you, an avatar that just embodies true nurturing, grace, love. So, what would this part of you say to try to change the behavior that you originally listed? So, in this example, I'll read you. You'll notice that I start by validating the feelings, like I mentioned earlier. So, I understand it makes you feel uncomfortable to practice being still when you're used to running around working all day and focusing on how much money you can make. And I notice that you're feeling depleted and disconnected. It seems like you even feel a little lost and frustrated when your energy goes to too many things at once. So try getting organized by making a list and putting your priorities in order of importance. Then you can reduce the amount of activities that you commit yourself to doing each day. So, what you'll notice in this response is I started with the emotions. So, I met myself where I was emotionally and validated those feelings. And then I went into the more problem solving mode or the solution finding mode. And that's important because many people fear that if they step away from inner criticism, that they're going to be less productive or less successful because they've just learned that that's the way to produce success. To push yourself further is to be mean, to be harsh. But again, that's wrong. All the research shows us that that is not true. And that's not true because when you exercise compassion toward yourself, you still have core values. You still have things in life that are important to you. So compassion is not the same as enabling someone. That is not compassionate at all. That's not advocating for well being. That's actually a toxic trait. So we don't want to think about self compassion like, oh, it's okay. I mean, I know it's hard to get up and go to school, so you don't have to. That's not compassion. Compassion is, I know you're tired. I know it's hard to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning. None of us really like to do that, but we have to because we have to go to school, because we have to keep learning and growing. That's just something we have to do. So in that example, it's like I'm feeling the emotions, but I am also exercising accountability with love and kindness. All right. So we're going to engage in some reflection. This is where I want to encourage you to use your chat so that we can share and see some of the things that people discovered in this exercise. So I'm just going to open up with a really general question, which is, what did you observe about yourself through this exercise? It could be maybe the first observation you've had of your inner critic, but it could also be that you've struggled with coming up with compassionate words for yourself. Or it could be that you couldn't really see what the inner critic was trying to do to help you. But I encourage you to let us know in the chat. I have higher expectations of myself than I do for others. I'm kinder to others. Yes. And those expectations, I'm glad you brought up expectations. Thank you, Lauren. Expectations are at the root of our suffering. So, exploring our expectations is a very important tool to use to change the outcomes in our life. For example, if you're dealing with a 2-year-old and you know that 2-year-olds have tantrums, then you're not as caught off guard when that happens. You're prepared for it. It's not as emotionally triggering. But then when you're interacting with an adult and you're expecting that they're going to have mature emotional reactions to life, and then all of a sudden they're having a tantrum like a 2-year old, then you feel bad all of a sudden. And the only difference in those two scenarios is that you had an expectation of the adult that because they were in an adult body, they were going to have adult emotional skills, which we all know is not true for everyone. So, yes, so exploring your expectations, including expectations of yourself, and not striving for perfectionism, but just striving for improvement. We want to set goals in life, we want to strive for those goals. And when we don't meet them, all we do is we circle back and we assess what went wrong, what can I do better, what am I learning? And now I'm going to try again. That's what a compassionate approach would be with expectations. Sarah said, I'm not extending kindness to myself that I instinctively extend to other people. Yeah, that's always like a really interesting realization to have, especially since I think I can say this for Sarah. Sarah is also a mental health practitioner. And so when you're someone who works with people and is literally teaching people how to be kind and how to be loving, and then we look inside ourselves and we're like, wow, I'm not being that kind or loving with myself. That can be a little surprising. So thank you for sharing. Angie said, I don't extend the same amount of grace and kindness to myself as I do to others. Yes. And so, with that, I was thinking also that sometimes people struggle to have the words to extend grace and kindness to their self. And that's why I love that mantra. Am I speaking to myself the way I speak to someone I love? Because if you already do that with other people, your brain knows how to do that. But typically, what's blocking that on some level is shame and a sense of unworthiness, that I am not worthy of the same grace and kindness that I extend to other people. And so, as you're working on building this practice, if it's hard to find those words toward yourself because of some of those emotional blocks, try doing the more like third party approach where you're like, what would I be saying to my best friend or my mom or my child or something like that, and then that can help you have the words that you need. Yes, several people had very similar responses. Someone was commenting, Devin said, I'm very harsh on myself for any perceived shortcomings. Yeah, so that's going to be like a tendency toward perfectionism, which also comes from an underlying feeling of shame and fear of shame. So, perfectionism is actually a maladaptive coping skill that is designed to help us avoid shame. Because on some level, our brain thinks if I'm perfect, then nobody can correct me. And I will not have to face the fact that I have things I need to work on, that I do things incorrectly. And the problem with perfectionism is that it's impossible. I like to say you've already broken your record with perfectionism. It's done, it's dead. You're not going to be able to achieve that in life. But what happens is our focus on perfect becomes stronger when we don't when we don't lean into self-reflection and learning. So then instead of focusing on learning and moving away from the perfectionism, we go, oh, I wasn't perfect enough. I'll be more perfect next time. And we keep ratcheting up that anxiety and that pressure that we put on ourselves. So, yes, that is a common thing that people experience, Devin. Thanks for sharing. Mary Beth said, I repeat this pattern over and over again. Barb said, I am my harshest critic. Yes. And again, Barb, I just want to encourage that working with our own critic is one of the most generous things we can do in an effort to show compassion to the rest of the world, because we can only show other people the love that we extend to ourselves. And when it comes to resilience and the work of Dr. Brene Brown and what she's pioneered through her research, we know that self-compassion and empathy are the heart and soul of resiliency. So if you master nothing else in resilience, you really want to hone in on empathy and self-compassion. Amy said, I'm reluctant to be introspective and honest with myself. Yeah. So maybe like hitting up against a little bit of just denial or avoidance, which I will say anybody that has any symptoms related to past trauma, avoidance is a universal symptom of people who have not healed or resolved trauma. So that reluctance is a form of wanting to avoid some places that are sensitive. And that's why sometimes doing self-discovery, it's good to have someone who can hold you accountable with love and care, because we can be expert level avoiders. Lauren said it's hard to answer the question of how the inner critic is trying to save you. I'm struggling to stick to a morning routine, even though it sounds or seems simple. Yeah. So in that regard, it could just be that the inner critic is trying to save you from failing your own goals. It could be if you're trying to get up in the morning because you want to be healthier, to be stronger, to be more fit, to be more productive. It could be related to that the inner critic's trying to save you from, neglecting your own health or your own self. Those are just some shots in the dark. This says, Sarah said, the things my internal mother avatar said on my list felt good, and I felt supported instead of shamed, like I felt with the inner critic. I can see how this can be more effective and healthy. Yes. So when we asked with the inner critic, what effect does this have on you to hear these words and to be criticized in this way? What you will probably notice is it's self-sabotaging. So when I'm being pressured, when I'm being spoken to in a mean and harsh voice, I'm going to tend to go, no, I don't want to work with you. No, I don't want to do anything. I'm actually avoiding the thing that I'm trying to pressure myself into doing. So it works the opposite way. Whereas when we're kind to ourselves and supportive, it makes it more approachable. And we tend to have the urge to want to continue working on whatever it is we're trying to change. Shelley said, I don't like to give myself grace, but I'm willing to give it to anyone else. Yes, thanks, Shelley. Lori said, overly critical of self bleeds over when interacting with others. I'm not sure if I overly critical of self. Oh, okay. Overly critical of self bleeds over when interacting with others. Yes, totally. Because remember, our outside reality and what we're experiencing, it's always a mirror reflection of some aspect of ourselves. So I encourage my clients, when you're to a point in the self-development journey where you feel courageous enough to interact with the world in this way, start seeing every interaction, every person, every experience in your life as a reflection of yourself. Some of them reflect the really beautiful, amazing parts of yourself, and others reflect the parts of yourself that you're having trouble integrating. And that's where that resistance is. That's where the judgment and criticism comes up. And so that's a key for us to go, wow, whatever it is that's bothering me about them, I have not resolved in myself. And that's an area where I need to maybe go in and find out what is that about? Why am I being so harsh about that? And how can I reclaim the power and the purpose of this shadow attribute of myself versus trying to cut it off and push it away? Because healing is about creating wholeness and integration, not cutting parts of ourselves off. Judy said, I'm nicer to others than myself. Yes, this is a theme you'll be noticing. Joyce said, I'm not practicing kindness daily to myself through words as I do to others. Yes. So, perhaps setting an intention or giving yourself permission to start by even just writing down affirmations. I like to do that. I mean, I'm not militant about this, but on a daily basis, I try to write down at least a page of affirmations that are positive, because again, if your brain doesn't have a pool to draw from of language, then it can be hard to extend compassion. So developing the language is a creative opportunity in and of itself. And so even just taking time to develop language that's supportive so that you have a pool to draw on, that can be very helpful. Lauren said, thank you. I came up with my critic trying to save me from the pressure of establishing a habit and disappointing myself if I don't stick to it. Yes. I have a story about that. Years ago, I worked with a woman who she had ran on the Mizzou cross country team in college, and she was a recreational therapist at the hospital where I worked. And I always just saw her as like, picture of perfect health. Her and her daughter ran marathons and all this stuff. Well, one day she came into my office after Christmas and she was like, I really think that these magazines that talk about fitness and stuff, they need to talk about it like it's a cyclical thing. And I was like, what do you mean? And she said, well, like me. She said, I'll be on a workout routine, and then when Thanksgiving and Christmas comes, like I'll gain like 20 pounds and I won't be working out. And then I'll go back and work, establish my routine again when the year starts and do well for a few months and then fall off. And it was just really good for me to hear that story because it helped me to be more compassionate with myself and to see the way that I was telling myself a story about people who I viewed to be healthier than me being perfect. And that story's not true. Even professional athletes have off seasons. So bringing more kindness to yourself in that way. Thanks for sharing. Yay. And then Joyce is just sending gratitude. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Joyce. So I loved all of your comments. Thank you for your thoughtful reflections. I wanted to say also that the reason I asked you about the tone of voice that you use is because we know that the way you say something is much more important than what you say. So, for example, if someone says, I love you, that's not very convincing, right? The words are, I love you, but the action says the opposite. So, cultivating an inner voice that is convincing in the way that it cares and nurtures with kindness is an important part of your self compassion practice. And Dr. Kristen Neff, she says that she even likes to use terms of endearment with herself, like darling, sweetheart, because she finds that that type of language really allows her to soften even more to herself. And so that's why we want to focus on how am I saying it? And it can be helpful to draw on examples from the external. If there are other women or other voices, it could be men too, that are calming to you, that are soothing to you, seeing if you can adopt some of those aspects in the way you speak to yourself. And finally, I wanted to share that there is a relationship between the compassionate self and the inner critic. And that relationship is that they want the very same thing for you. They just have two different ways of communicating the same thing. So, this little guy has the pitchfork. It's like if I was running a marathon, the inner critic would be the one that's, screaming profanities to me and poking me in the butt with the pitchfork and, prodding me along. And I don't want to run a marathon anyways. So if you try to motivate me like that, I'm probably just going to go and sit on the side of the road and say, forget this. The compassionate self, though, you can see her nurturing her little butterfly along. She's the one who she runs up alongside you and she has a cool compress and she has a bottle of water. And she says, it doesn't matter how fast or slow we go. Even if we have to crawl past the finish line, we're going to do it together. And that type of voice, that type of person, I'm much more likely to finish a marathon with. And so think of that the next time you are accessing your compassionate self and just knowing that these are two sides of the same coin. All right. Well, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule today. Again, my name's Emily. I'm the owner of Empowered Life. If you want to reach out to me, here's my website, mlifecounseling.com, and I would love to connect with you in the future. And thank you so much to the library for hosting this as well as Children's Grove for sponsoring it. We can't hear you, Lauren. Sorry.
Sorry about that. Thank you. I just want to say thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us this afternoon. I know that I could use some self-compassion and practice, and so I, for one, very much appreciate it. And again, thank you to the Children's Grove for sponsoring this event. Everyone, take care.